Today we'll have a look at how well the RTX 3060 runs Cyberpunk 2077 and which settings we should use. I tested 1080p and 1440p with and without ray tracing. Many people will tell you that ray tracing is a gimmick on a card like the 3060. But if it's your first ray tracing capable card, we know that you want to try it, and if used in moderation, it runs just fine. As shown on the overlay, the game runs at around 70 FPS. We'll look at more in-game footage and comparisons in a second, but first I want to go over the benchmark results quickly. The Cyberpunk benchmark overestimates in-game performance. My rule of thumb is to aim for a score 20 to 25% higher than what you'll accept as your worst in-game frame rate when playing. So if your score is 75 FPS in a benchmark, you'll seldom encounter an in-game scenario that will drop your FPS below 60. At 1440p we can see that either of the optimized settings, default and higher, which I'll show you later, seem ideal at either quality or balanced DLSS, scoring between 80 and 96 FPS. At 1080p the optimized higher setting at native resolution looks good, and you can get a nice high frame rate when using DLSS quality. Although I made some adjustments, my optimized settings are close to what Digital Foundry initially determined to be best when Cyberpunk was released. These are the graphics settings I labeled optimized default on the plots. The optimized higher settings are the same, except for volumetric clouds, which goes on high, and ambient occlusion, which goes on medium. When we enable ray tracing, we'll keep these base settings the same. I tried enabling two ray tracing settings, lighting and reflections, but I think turning both on may be a bit much, so I'd stick to just ray traced lighting. It's possible to use both, but it requires running DLSS balanced at 1080p and DLSS performance at 1440p. I benchmarked a few in-game locations using various settings. Here we are at Judy's place at night overlooking Night City. This is 1080p. The top left is optimized default, no ray tracing and no DLSS. The top right is optimized higher, no ray tracing and no DLSS. The bottom left is optimized default, plus ray traced lighting and reflections using DLSS quality. The bottom right is optimized higher, but only ray traced lighting using DLSS quality. The night scene is a little harder to run than the same view during daytime. Both look fantastic and make me want to play Cyberpunk, but these are not among the most taxing spots. In Lizzie's bar we can appreciate the difference that ray traced lighting makes. The light under the bench in the center is more diffused around the ground, but still appears to glow brighter when RT lighting is on. The room is slightly brighter overall, and the red light in the left corner is more diffused. Running through the market area is a good test for worst case scenario performance. Of course, I was happy that my predictions based on the benchmark results held up. I did more in-game testing for 1080p than 1440p, but generally you want to increase your DLSS level by 1 when you go from 1080p to 1440p. The market looks glorious without fancy ray tracing, but ray traced lighting just gives it that little extra oomph. If you don't want ray tracing, you can use dynamic resolution scaling cleverly to get superior image quality at a fixed frame rate. For this, you want to create a custom resolution greater than your actual monitor resolution in your NVIDIA control panel. So if your monitor is 1080p, you can set it at 1440p for example. In-game, you'll then allow dynamic resolution scaling from 50 to 100% and choose your target frame rate based on benchmark charts in this video and your monitor's refresh rate. Choose it so it will rarely dip below your desired frame rate. Select your target frames per second slightly higher than your actual target, so that the game will budget marginally less time per frame. Then limit your frame rate to the target frame rate. The game will run at your desired frame rate and use excess GPU resources to super sample the image and give you the best anti-aliasing possible. It will also prevent frame dips by allowing the resolution to go below your native res momentarily, which shouldn't happen often if you've chosen your settings correctly. Let's talk CPUs for a second. I tested a Ryzen 5600G, a 6-core 12-thread Zen 3 CPU. I think it's fair to expect about the same performance on the Ryzen 3600 and an Intel i5 10400. For in-game testing, I used the medium crowd density setting. When using the high setting, you need a slightly more powerful CPU to avoid some of the brief dips that can occur when racing through the city at high speeds. High crowd density is absolutely in the cards on a Ryzen 5600G, but I want the video to focus entirely on GPU performance. I might do a Ryzen 5600G versus a Ryzen 5900X comparison in the future, so I recommend either of the optimized settings or something in between. If you don't notice a difference between the two, then go for the lower one. If you like ray tracing, you want to go for one extra level of DLSS, and if you don't, give the dynamic res scaling setting a try. You may or may not like it. If this was helpful, consider giving it a like and check out my channel. See you!